Okay, now, we don't have PowerPoint here, so you should have in your hymnals copies of the slides. Some of them have got the slides numbered and some of them haven't. So that you can keep up with me as I go through, what I will do is I'll tell you the slide number and the title of the slide so you can follow along. And our topic for tonight is the Gog-Magog War. There's a lot to talk about, so let's leap straight into that if we can. Now then, I don't know about you, but as a student of end times prophecy, this is one of the topics that I kind of skip over. We all want to know about the tribulation. Yeah, a great sin, I know. We all want to know about the tribulation and the second coming and the rapture. And we tend to kind of step over this one. It seems to be a kind of just a little bump or a blip in the road towards the final scenario at the end. But I decided a few months ago that I was going to have a little look at this. And the more I dug, the more I found out, and the more significant this event proved to be. So we read about the Gog-Magog War in Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's about a great trial that happens in the life of the nation of Israel, and people often call it the Gog-Magog War. And the subject of our inquiry today is this: to answer a small number of questions about this battle or this war. Is this just a happenstance? Or is this ordained by God? Is it, if it is ordained by God, is it simply to punish the nation of Israel? Or does it have a redemptive purpose in God's plan for the nation of Israel? So we're going to try and answer those questions. So what I want to do first, follow along on the slides. We're on the prophecy part 1, or slide number 3. I'll just read a small selection from chapters 38 and 39, just to remind you of the detail we're given in the prophecy about this event. This is from Ezekiel 38, verses 1 to 6. The word of the Lord came to me: Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, fully armed, and a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets. Also Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, many nations with you. Therefore, Son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In that day, when my people Israel are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? You will come from your place in the far north, you and the many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In days to come, Gog, I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. Now, we know this is a real event, but there are many, many Christians who don't believe this is a real event. And among them are those who have adopted replacement theology. And they believe that the church has replaced Israel, God has no further purpose for Israel, all the functions that God had once planned that Israel would perform are now given to the church. And I've extracted on slide number 5, titled, This is the Real Event, a selection of text that I've drawn from the Ligonier, or Ligonier, am I pronouncing that right? Ligonier website, yeah. And listen to this. Given the symbolism of the passage, there's some warning signs. They think there's a lot of symbolism in here. Given the symbolism of the passage, we must see it not only as a prediction of the final battle between God and the enemies of his people, but also a vision of the encounter between New Covenant Israel, the church, and the Lord's chosen. For 2,000 years, God's enemies have tried to destroy the church, only to find themselves converted to him. When people come against the Lord, their plans will be thwarted, either in their salvation or in their defeat and destruction. These people don't believe this is a real event, which is really strange when you consider that in the previous chapter, chapter 37, there is a prophecy about the reconstitution of the nation of Israel. It's called the Valley of Dry Bones prophecy. And it talks about these dry bones lying around on the ground, coming together, rattling and clunking and coming together, and then sinews and tendons joining them, and then muscle and flesh being put on them, and then skin covering them, and then in a separate event, life being breathed into them. And God tells us this is about the people of Israel. And this is a prophecy about the formation of the nation of Israel. Now, what do the people who believe in replacement theology make of that passage when the event actually happened in 1948 and continues to happen even today? In stages, the nation of Israel has been brought together until all of them will be there in the land. This is a real-world event. So the next question we have to ask is, has it already happened? Has it been done? Have we missed it? We can answer this fairly straightforwardly. If you look back through the history of Israel, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament up to the 1st century AD, and their existence since 1948, in the last 75 years, there is no event like this in Israel. There has been no war that Israel has fought, either in Old Testament or the current times, where they fought exactly the mix of nations that the Lord says are going to be involved in this battle. And I'll tell you what the nations are in a minute and how I got to selecting them or identifying them. No battle like that. No battle with a 7-year clear-up. No battle where they had to spend 7 months burying the dead bodies. They had to give over an entire valley in the land to intern them. And they renamed it Ham and Gog. There's never been a valley called Ham and Gog in Israel's history, or never been a town called Hamona. So, what we can say is that it has never happened in the past, which leaves only one alternative. It's yet to happen in the future. There's a future fulfillment. And we know that because it says so in the text. Because it says in places, it uses in places the words end times and latter years. And the NASB, New American Standard Bible, interprets Ezekiel 38, verse 8 in this way. After many days you will be summoned, that's Gog. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword. And we know from these uses of these terms, latter years, that we're talking about the end times. We can't put a date on it any more accurately than that. But what a number of scholars have tried to do is they've tried to place it in the context of other end times prophetic events, notably the tribulation. So they've said, can we discern whether this comes after the tribulation, during it, or before it? And those are the three different views that are discussed in the literature. Some people, including some very eminent scholars, such as John Walvoord, Dwight Pentecost, Charles Ryrie, believe that this battle will take place in the first half of the tribulation, in the first 3.5 years. So the tribulation period begins when Israel signs a covenant with Antichrist. This will be a protection pact, if you like. God calls it the covenant of death. And after 3.5 years, he breaks the covenant and he starts persecuting Israel. And people like John Walvoord think that this battle takes place in that period. And the reason they think that is because in the text of the prophecy in Ezekiel, it talks about Israel seemingly being at peace or at rest. And they've looked at the 75 years of Israel's history and they've said they've never had any rest. Roughly every 4 years on average, they're fighting someone. Okay? And they've said it's only during that 3.5 years that they'll have peace. But there's a problem with that. Because if the battle happens in the first 3.5 years of tribulation, how are they going to spend the next 7 years burying the dead and cleaning up? Because persecution breaks out at the halfway point. And the Jews in Israel will be running for their lives. They won't be able to coordinate a cleanup campaign. And it also runs into the Battle of Armageddon. Yeah? And what the critics of this view say is that if you look at the text carefully, it doesn't necessarily say that Israel is at peace. It says they're living in safety in the land. And for 75 years, they have lived in safety in the land because of the Israeli Defense Force protecting them. And even now, they're fighting in Gaza and in Lebanon, but they're still living safely in the land because of their security forces. This view that it happens at the end of the tribulation, Louis Bauman, Charles Feinberg believe this, and Jewish scholars. So Jewish eschatology holds this view as well. And what they do in this case is they take the Gog-Magog war and the Battle of Armageddon and they merge them, and they say they're one and the same. Because there's certain similarities between them. Both are placed in the latter years. We know that's true. Both accounts talk about mass amounts of dead bodies lying around the land being attacked by carrion eaters. And both of them declare that at the close of that battle, the people acknowledge God. The people of Israel acknowledge God. But there's problems. Armageddon will be a battle waged by all nations, not just a limited number, as in the case of the Gog-Magog war. The locations of the battles are different. One is in the valley of Jezreel, the other is on the mountains of Israel. There's different leaders of the attacking forces. Gog in one instance, the Antichrist in the other. They're fighting against a different foe. The Battle of Magog is against the people of Israel. In the Battle of Armageddon, they're fighting against the returning Messiah. So, for all these reasons, we know that these are two entirely separate events, separated by a period of 7 to 10, 15 years maybe. So we can dismiss this view, which only leaves one other, that this event happens before the tribulation itself. How close to the tribulation, we don't know, but it could be as close as 3.5 years. If the battle happens 3.5 years before the tribulation, then there's a full 7 years to carry out the cleanup before the persecution breaks out in the middle of the tribulation. But it also might be earlier than that. And the earlier it is, the greater the chance that the church will see it. Because it could come before the rapture. Some people think it won't, but I happen to think that it's possible. And the earlier it happens, the more likely it is the church will see it. Which means some of us will possibly see it. And what a wonderful thing to see. God intervening in the world to destroy the enemies of his people in the way that he did in Old Testament times. Why doesn't God do that anymore? Why doesn't he intervene in the world in the way he did in Old Testament times? Well, he will. Right. Who is Gog? The name Gog appears 3 times in Scripture. In 1 Chronicles, chapter 5, it talks about a descendant of Jacob, his personal name is Gog. So it can be a personal name. We see it again in Revelation, when Gog and Magog are used, but they're used to represent figuratively the rebellious nations of the world. Because Gog and Magog fight against the camp of God at the end of the millennial reign, when Satan is released into the world and he turns everyone against, a lot of people in the world, against the Messiah, and they come marching across the globe and attack the camp of God. And they're described as Gog and Magog. So that's 2 different ways in which Gog can be understood. The most likely meaning for Gog is of a title. In modern Hebrew, it means rooftop or mountain. So it's most likely to mean king, or a chief, or a Caesar, or a pharaoh, or a president. That is most likely its interpretation in this context of Ezekiel. Who are the aggressor nations that he's leading? So Gog is the leader, the head, the chief, if you like, or the pinnacle of this coalition or this axis that are coming to attack Israel. Who are these nations? Now, if you've tried to read any books about the Gog-Magog war, or any articles online, you will very rapidly realize that there are as many different opinions about what these nations are as there are people expressing opinions about who these nations are. So I sat down and thought, well, how can I maximize the chances of getting this right? So I came up with a list of assumptions, or rules, if you like, that if I followed, it maximizes the chance that I get these nations right. And what are they? Well, it stands to reason that God uses names for these nations that Ezekiel would understand. They would be current in his day, which is in the 6th century BC. The names he uses are grandsons or great-grandson of Noah. There is one nation name, which is Persia, but all the others are people. They're all descendants of Noah, either grandsons or great-grandson. Ezekiel would have known from Scripture where those people settled. He would have known what people groups arose from them. And if they'd subsequently moved their location, emigrated, as lots of people do today, by his time, he would know where they went. Yeah? So I thought, okay, if I follow these rules, then I should be able to figure out what these nations are. So I'm now on slide number 13, which is entitled, Who are the Aggressor Nations? So let's go through these very quickly. Gog is said to come from the nation of Magog. Magog is one of Japheth's sons. He's a grandson of Noah. And Scripture tells us that they settled north of the Black Sea in an area which today is eastern Ukraine and southern Russia. They were nomadic, and they spread around ultimately in all sorts of different places, Kazakhstan and even further east. But by the 6th century BC, by Ezekiel's day, they were still there in their original place. And they developed into what history tells us is the people known as the Scythians. So we know from this that Magog is Russia. Next one, Meshech, another one of Japheth's sons. They settled in central and eastern Turkey, or he settled there. And ancient sources such as Josephus identifies the people that arose from him as Cappadocia in east central Turkey and Phrygia in west central Turkey. So here we have a reference to a people living in Turkey. So we know the second nation involved in this axis is Turkey. The third one is Tubal. There's been lots of very fanciful identifications here, including identifying Tubal with the central Russian city of Tobolsk, based solely on similarity between their names. There's nothing in Scripture that tells us where these people are located, but ancient sources, including Josephus, says that these people were the ancestors of modern-day Georgians. So it's just below southern Russia, between southern Russia and northeastern Turkey and Syria. So the most likely identification of this nation is again Turkey. So we've had two references to Turkey, because some of the modern nations that these refer to were made up of smaller nations in the past. So you're going to get multiple identifications with that nation in places. Persia is an easy one. That's the name of a nation, an ancient name for Iran. Some scholars point out that Persia actually at its height also included part of Pakistan. But I've been conservative, and I've said, okay, that's a possibility, but what we know for definite is Iran. So we now have three nations, led by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. Cush is often incorrectly identified with Ethiopia, but it isn't Ethiopia, because it's the ancient kingdom of Nubia. And Nubia was located in the very south of Egypt and in Sudan below it. So we know that this is present-day Sudan. Interestingly, Sudan tends to go below the radar in terms of its behavior and attitude towards Israel. Madeleine Albright, the former US Secretary of State, describes Sudan as a viper's nest of terrorism and extremism. It is one of the most anti-Semitic, Israel-hating nations on the planet. And it manufactures most of the weapons that the Houthis are using in Yemen. Last three. Put is understood from biblical sources to be the land west of Egypt. And that is almost certainly Libya, but it also could include all or parts of Tunisia and Algeria. So again, I've been conservative, and I've said that with certainty it is Libya. Libya is another very, very anti-Semitic country. It's a failed state. It's in three parts, run by three different governments. But even then, they regularly hold anti-Israel demonstrations in their cities. Gomer is a little more contested. There's no biblical reference to where Gomer is an eldest son of Japheth, where they settled. Ancient sources tell us that the people that arose from Japheth, from Gomer, were the Cimmerians. And they settled originally in Russia and Kazakhstan, but they later moved. And by Ezekiel's day, the 6th century BC, they'd moved down into central Turkey and part of Persia. So take your pick. Some ancient Jewish sources, such as the Talmud tractate Yoma, say that this is Germany, but there's no evidence in the historical record of the Cimmerians ever going anywhere near Germany. So most likely we're talking about Turkey here. So that's three references to Turkey. So we can be fairly sure that Turkey is involved in this axis. Finally, we've got a nation called Beth Togarmah. Beth means house of, and Togarmah was a son of Gomer. So he's a great-grandson of Noah. The Bible describes this nation as being in the far north. Some people say that this is a city called Togarmah on the Turkish-Syrian border. But modern scholarship identifies this with a city called Togarmah, which is in southeast Anatolia. So that again is Turkey. So that's the fourth reference to Turkey. That's the most likely. But it could also be Armenia. Let's deal with the issue of Rosh. Some people believe that Rosh is another member of this axis. And the reason they do is because there's two different ways of translating the word Rosh in Hebrew. One is as an adjective, and the other is as a noun. And the Greek Septuagint translates it as an adjective, and all the Bible translations that come from there translate the word Rosh as chief. So that would mean that Gog is chief prince. Okay, the pinnacle of all the other chieftains, the one running the show. The Latin Vulgate translate Rosh as a noun, and all the Bible translations that come from that identify it with a nation called Rosh, which they say is Russia, because there is a nation called Rosh or Roshu or Rishu, depending upon which country's records you look at, which refers to peoples in southern Russia. But it doesn't really matter, because we've got Russia anyway. Yeah, I happen personally to think that this is should be translated as chief. So there we go. We've got Russia, and we've got four other nations with it. We can be certain that these are part of the Axis, but there are a whole bunch of other nations that could also be involved. Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Tunisia, Kazakhstan, the Stan republics. Remember that God says of Gog, and the many nations with you. There could be up to 20 nations in this axis. And there almost certainly be some other nations we haven't mentioned who have to be involved in some way because they're so geographically related to Israel, Lebanon, and Syria and Jordan. Now, when those armies come, whether they come in from Iran or down from Turkey from the north, they have to cross through those countries to get to Israel, which means that they have to be complicit in some way, allowing these armies to come through, even if they're not contributing forces to the fighting. There's a couple of non-combatants. In Ezekiel 38:13, we read, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all her strong lions, that's sometimes translated many villages, will say to you, have you come to plunder? Have you gathered your hoards to loot, to carry off silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods and seize much plunder? Now, Sheba and Dedan were sons of Shem, and we know he settled in Saudi Arabia. So we know those two references are to Saudi Arabia, which means that Saudi Arabia is in some kind of friendly disposition towards Israel at this point. And it's notable that they are trying to normalize relations with Israel now. And some people think it was because they're trying to normalize relations that Iran told Hamas to attack Israel to try and disrupt that process. But they're still saying, okay, when the dust has settled on this, we still want to normalize relations with Israel, recognize each other and our rights to exist and start trading with one another. Tarshish is much more difficult to identify. Different opinions. Some people think it's the town of Tarsus in northern Israel. Unlikely, because they're the country being attacked. They're not a non-combatant. Some people think Sardinia. Very unlikely again, because they're not a big player in any way in a modern world. The most likely is Tartessus, which is in Ezekiel's day a port operated by the Phoenicians in southern Spain, on the coast of Spain. And it's interesting that this prophecy talks about the merchants of Tarshish. So these have been the Phoenician traders. And what some scholars are saying is that the Phoenicians were trading all along the Mediterranean coast, all around into Western Europe, right up into the United Kingdom, into Britain. And therefore what they're saying is that describing them as the merchants of Tarshish means anywhere that the Phoenicians traded. That means Western Europe. And these strong lions, or many villages, they say are the former colonies in the New World of Western Europe. It's a stretch, isn't it? But it's plausible. And if you think geopolitically, what are the nations that would stand up and complain about this? It's with the liberal democracies. But what we can take from this, the important thing is, nobody comes to Israel's help. There's aggressors, there's Israel, and there's non-combatants who point the finger at this axis and say, we know what you're really up to, but they don't do anything else. Right. Who starts this war? Is it Gog? It's not. We read in Ezekiel 38 that God himself is the cause of this war. This is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army and horses. This is God is telling us that probably left to his own devices, Gog wouldn't do this. But God so arranges things that he has no choice but to come out and be involved in this battle, in this war. God determines this will happen. He's predestined this to happen. And that's why he's able to tell us about it in advance in these prophecies. God says he's against Gog. Why? Well, this is Russia. This is the leader of Russia, the president. It could be Putin or a successor. Usually when God is against nations and punishes nations, it's because of their treatment of Israel. And Russia has been very brutal towards Jews over its history, both Tsarist Russia, Soviet Russia, and now. In Tsarist Russia, there were the pogroms, and the Tsarist forces spread anti-Semitic misinformation about Jews all around the world. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is still doing the rounds, that fraudulent document, was written by the Tsarist Russian Secret Service. They forbade Jews from leaving Israel during the Soviet era. And they've supplied the enemies of Israel with the weapons used to wage war on them. If that's the reason why God is against Gog and Russia, then he's got to also be against these other nations. Because they're all anti-Semitic, they all hate Israel, and they all seek Israel's destruction. I'm on slide 21 now. It's called the motivation of the Axis. Hope I haven't left you behind. Now, in the prophecy itself, Ezekiel 38, 12 and 13, we're given a motivation for them coming to fight. I will plunder and loot, this is Gog talking, and turn my hand against the resettled ruins and the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land. This is unlikely to be the motivation of Gog and Russia. Their motivation will be more strategic, but it will be at least part of the motivation of the Muslim states which are coming against Israel as part of this axis. Because they want to massacre all Jews. They're about genocide. They want to kill all the Jews, rid the land of Jewish people, and then return that land to the zone of Islam. Because it was formerly, at various times in history, part of the zone of Islam, the Islamic Caliphate, if you like. And they see this as an insult to Allah, that land that was once devoted to him has now been taken away by infidels. And they want that overturned. But they will think their reward for engaging in this genocide is being able to carry away anything that isn't nailed down. They will rape and pillage and kill and torture, but when it's all done, anything that isn't nailed down, they'll take, including many of the bank accounts in the Israeli banks. But their jewelry, their cash, their cars and vehicles, their livestock, everything. They would strip the nation. Russia's motivation is more strategic. Start working, will you? There we go. Russia's motivation is more strategic. Russia's motivation is always to extend Russian influence. The reason they fought wars in the past has either been self-defense or to extend their influence, to stop breakaway republics, to subdue other nations and bring them to heel. This is why they do things. And in this case, what they will be about is extending their hegemony over the Middle East. They want a new world order. They want to break the power of the West, and particularly America. And the Middle East is Russia's backyard. And they want control. They want to hold sway over that place. And knocking out America's biggest ally in the Middle East is a good way of taking away America's interest in the place. And even if America withdraws further from the Middle East and Europe, as it is currently doing, so that they're not there to protect Israel, Israel will still be the cornerstone of opposition to countries like Turkey and Iran and Russia from extending their hegemony in that place. Unofficially, Israel is currently allied with United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in opposition to Iran growing its influence in that region. And it's also very much against Turkey extending its influence, even in Syria, which it's currently trying to do. So that will be its motivation. Another motivation for the Axis, this slide 23, is that all these Muslim countries have a mutual hatred of Israel. They absolutely loathe Israel. And they actually believe, many Muslims believe, that in order for the Mahdi to come back and conquer the world for Islam, they have to start a war of genocide against the Jews. And they will believe this is it. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, there's a problem in the prophecy, slide 24, the battle, the problem of ancient weapons, something that really doesn't make sense. In Ezekiel 38:4, we read this, "And I will bring you out and all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them splendidly attired, a great company with buckler, that's a little round shield for close quarter fighting, and shields, and all of them wielding swords, all of them riding on horses." Now, I've actually read a commentator, an author, that's taken this literally and said, well, what's going to happen is these countries are going to cast aside their modern weapons and they're going to come at Israel with shields and spears and bows and ride horses. How credible is that? Anything's possible, but that would be the worst military decision since the charge of the Light Brigade. Now, what God is doing here is he is talking to Ezekiel and those people that hear him in using military terminology they would understand, that would be relevant for them. And we have to remember that for the best part of 2,500 years, these would have been the weapons that a modern army used. It's only in the last 150 years that we developed weapons technologies which are superior to these. And some people think the longbow is still better than a rifle. So what Ezekiel would have taken from this is that this isn't a rabble. This isn't a bunch of thugs armed with clubs. This is a modern, well-trained, well-equipped army who don't have to march on foot. They've got transport. Yeah? These are the professionals. So the way we interpret that is that this is a modern army, a mechanized army with all the accoutrement of a modern weapon, of modern armed forces. Slide 25, military firepower. So I thought, okay, if you take these 5 nations and you find some information about the size of their militaries and compare them to the size of Israel's military, you can get some idea as to just how outgunned Israel is. So I've done that in this figure. What I've done is I've gone to the official data on the size of the militaries of these different countries, and I've deducted 1/3 and said 1/3 has to stay at home to defend the nation and keep order, and 2/3 is mobile, so they can take it into the coalition and invade Israel with it. And from this you can see that 2/3 of the armed forces of these nations amounts to almost 4 million men. That's today. 4 million men. And Israel's armed forces is 670,000. And that includes their Navy and their Air Force too. Their army is about 500,000, including all their reserves. They're massively outnumbered. In terms of tanks, this axis has got 13,000 tanks today. Israel's got 1,300. They've got 16,500 artillery and rocket pieces. Israel's got 1,100. And they've got 4,000 military aircraft, and Israel's got 600. So it's fighters and bombers. Israel just couldn't survive an onslaught like that. Israel has got some of the best generals and equipment and highly motivated army. They're well led, but attrition will undo them. They could hold the line for a few days, but they could knock out 5 or 6 of the enemy for every one of theirs and still lose, because within a few weeks they'll be out of ordnance and out of men and out of tanks. And this coalition can sustain these losses. And it's very interesting. This Hamas attack on Israel has totally changed the perspective of Israel's enemies about what it takes to beat Israel. Before, and for the last 20 years, countries like Iran and Syria have believed that they can undermine Israel using proxy forces. So they've set up and equipped and direct Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic State in the Levant, and so on, and a few others. But after Hamas' attack on Israel, Israel then turned its guns on them and has destroyed them. And countries like Turkey and Iran and Syria now understand you can't beat Israel using proxy forces. The only thing that's going to beat Israel is massive overforce, massively outnumbering them. You've got to overwhelm them with sheer force of numbers. That's the only thing that's going to beat them. And that is why they put a coalition like this together. Okay, 26, the course of the battle, very quickly. Some commentators say that the invasion is going to come from the north because some of these countries are in the north, and there will be troop movements and armored movements from the north through Syria and Lebanon, South Lebanon. But that's too small an area to allow an army to marshal 4 million men with their tanks and artillery, too small. So they're going to have to spread out more than that. So what they will do is they will attack from every point of contact with Israel. They will attack through Syria, they will attack through Jordan from the east. And it's interesting that it works to the attacker's advantage because they've got greater numbers. Is that the broader the front you create, the thinner the defenders have to spread themselves. So in some places, they'll just be able to walk across the border because Israel won't have enough men to defend those places. And it's also interesting that as soon as you cross over the border into Israel, from the north or the east, you go straight onto the mountains of Israel. Because there's a spine of mountains from the north all the way down the eastern flank, right down into the Negev. And you go across that border straight onto those mountains. How does God destroy Gog's forces? He uses 4 different means. We're talking about the forces on the mountains of Israel, not the nations themselves. He uses an earthquake, a great earthquake. He causes infighting amongst the troops. Now, that great earthquake is probably the most powerful in the history of the Middle East. It doesn't take much of an earthquake to destroy buildings, and we read in the prophecy that every wall in Israel will fall to the ground. It takes a much bigger earthquake to overturn mountains and bring cliff faces down. And that's the scale of the earthquake that God causes. It's only in Israel, nowhere else, just Israel. The dislocating effect of that will be massive. All transport networks, all communications, all infrastructure totally destroyed. So those forces will be locked in place on the mountains of Israel, those attacking forces. And all the cities of Israel will be destroyed. Next, infighting amongst the troops. There's been times in the past when Israel and Jerusalem have been attacked by a much more powerful force, and God has caused a kind of paranoid insanity amongst the enemy troops, and they've attacked and killed one another in the same units. And he could very well do this again now. That might be what he's saying. It could also be that he causes suspicion and fighting between the nations. But whatever happens, however he does it, it's the biggest friendly fire incident in human history. He also uses torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and burning sulfur. Now, that is just going to wash away roads, burst dams and rivers, cause massive flooding, which have direct killing effects. But it's also going to turn that landscape into a mudscape. There'll be no moving vehicles and moving goods and supplies around on those mountains once he starts. The hailstones will kill anything out in the open. The burning sulfur will poison the air, so it'll become toxic, and the fire will incinerate and burn anything that's flammable, including people. Is that enough? There can't be many people left after that, can there? But there's more. There will also be plague. I will execute judgment on him with plague and bloodshed. Now, this could, even if he didn't do anything supernatural here, plague would happen anyway, because you've got a saturated land with dead bodies lying everywhere. Sooner or later, plague is going to break out. But it's also possible that God will inflict plague directly onto these combatants in the same way he's going to do to the combatants in the Battle of Armageddon, which act so quickly that their tongues and their eyes rot in their heads even while they're standing up. So that's entirely possible. But there's something else. Oh, let's just pause for a moment. Why does he have to use so many things, so many different approaches? I mean, there have been times in Israel's history where he's just used one of these to destroy their enemy. Fires come down from heaven, kill them, gone. They've gone mad and killed one another, gone. Why use all these things? It's so there can be no doubt that this is him. Any one, and people will say, oh, it's just a fluke, a happenstance. But not if he uses all of these things. Not only does he cause destruction to the armies on the mountains of Israel, he also goes after the countries that sent them. And he says that he sends fire on Magog and those who live in safety in the coastlands, and they will know that I'm the Lord. Notably, all these countries in this axis have very large coastlines, with major cities and large populations living in those coastal regions. And he says he sends fire on them. And this opens up the interesting possibility that this is Israel using its nuclear weapons. God might send fire from heaven, but it's also possible that Israel will use its nuclear weapons, because it's the worst kept military secret in history that Israel has got a stock of nuclear weapons. They don't talk about it, but they've done enough to let people know, and nod and a wink, that they've got them. And some people think that they've got as many as 200 warheads, and they've got 3 different means of delivering them: cruise missiles from submarines, planes, and they've got Jericho missiles, medium-range missiles they can use. And Israel, like every other country with nuclear weapons, has got a nuclear weapon doctrine which tells the world the circumstances under which they will use them. And the Israeli doctrine is called the Samson doctrine. And it says 2 things: that if they're attacked by overwhelming force, they will use tactical nuclear weapons against military sites to encourage these invaders to back off. But if they feel that they're about to be annihilated as a people, they will use everything they've got in a retaliatory way. And interestingly, Ariel Sharon, former Prime Minister of Israel, said once, "We're much more important than the Americans think. We can take the Middle East with us whenever we go." And he's basically saying, if the Muslims destroy us, we can destroy them. They will not exist. Slide 30, the aftermath of the battle. How are we doing for time? Are you all itching to get off home? Or can you stand a little bit more? Okay. The aftermath of the battle, slide 30. The cleanup. The most urgent thing that Israel will need to do is get rid of those dead bodies, because there's a human health hazard having millions of corpses and bits of bodies lying around with toxins getting into the groundwater. But also, under Israeli religious law, contact with a dead body makes a person or a thing unclean. So the land becomes ceremonial unclean, which means you can't use it for anything, including growing food. So they've got to cleanse the land and get those bodies out and intern them. And there's so many, they have to devote a whole valley in Israel for an internment site, and they call it Hamon Gog, which means hordes of Gog. And they build a village near it called Hamona to house the people involved in that activity. That takes 7 months. It takes 7 years to clean up all the wreckage. They have to deal with unused ordnance, unexploded bombs and mines and fuels and radioactive materials and all the rest. Human health problem again. They can burn anything that's flammable, but the biggest task for them is dealing with the metals. And that takes 7 years. They have to recycle those metals, they smelt them, but they will have a use for them because they've got to rebuild their entire nation. Every physical structure, every man-made structure has been destroyed. So they're going to have to build dams and roads and bridges and railways and schools and hospitals, and they're going to need all that metal for their poured concrete structures. There is changed, slide 31, a changed political landscape. Israel first. Israel's military will be gone, be totally degraded. It's possible that small numbers of surviving IDF come off the mountains into the urban areas as a last line of defense. But there'll be limited numbers. So their military will be gone, and that will make them paranoid and insecure. All their towns, villages, cities, structures destroyed, needing a complete rebuild. Their economy will be completely dislocated, and it will cost trillions to rebuild the nation, because they've been rebuilding it for 75 years. 75 years worth of construction, they've got to start again from scratch. The coalition countries, their militaries will be gone as well, but there will also be severe physical and economic damage to them from the fire being unleashed on them and on the cities and the coastlands. But, interestingly, this is going to be the biggest blow to Islam since it was invented, because they will be seeing this as the precipitation of the return of the Mahdi. the moment when they finally destroy Israel, and Muslims will be dancing in the streets when their armies are on the mountains of Israel and they realize they've got Israel beaten. And they'll be celebrating in the streets, and the imams will be broadcasting to the crowds, victory is ours, Palestine will be returned, the Mahdi will come. But God intervenes, and instead of giving them the victory, he gives them defeat. How will they explain that? A mortal body blow to Islam. It will never be the force it is now again because of that event. How close are we to this event? Well, some of the things that have to be in place for it to happen are already there. Israel already exists. There's a unifying mechanism available for all the countries in the coalition, Islam. Israel exists in a state of safety for its people because of its powerful military. And all these nations have reason to hate and despise Israel and want its destruction. Slide 34. Is a coalition forming? Bearing in mind that the prerequisites are already there, do we see any evidence of the coalition of these nations forming now? And interestingly, we do. And it's been happening just in the last few years. So what I've done is, very quickly, I'll go through the links, the relationship between the three big countries. Because Russia, Turkey, and Iran account for 90% of all the military heft in this coalition. The others are just bit part players. Turkey and Iran have hated one another historically and been deeply suspicious of one another because they both want to be top dog in the Middle East. The leaders of Iran want an Islamic caliphate with them at the top. And the current leader of Turkey wants to revive the Ottoman Empire with him seen as the savior of Islam. He wants the Turkish flag flying over the Palestinian territories. And they've been secretly fighting one another. Turkey has been trying to wean Hamas off Iran by lavishing them with funding and training and safe habitation in Turkey. And Turkey hates Hezbollah, absolutely hates them, because Hezbollah has been propping up Assad's regime in Syria that Turkey wanted removed, and been fighting against Turkish proxy forces in Syria and supplying arms to the Kurds. They absolutely hate Hezbollah. But Turkey has lurched to the east because of its increasingly authoritarian government. And it knows that it can't do business with the West anymore. So it's looking for new allies, and Russia and Iran are it. That's why it's got increasingly good relationships with Russia, because Russia provides it with arms and all its oil and gas, or most of it. Iran supplies some as well. Russia is now a pariah state. It's looking for friends and allies, and it's looking for ways of busting Western sanctions. And Iran is the world's leading expert at busting Western sanctions. It's been doing it for 20 years. And Iran provides a land bridge for Russian goods and oil and gas to flow into Southeast Asia. Because there's a bunch of countries down there, including India, that don't much care for Western sanctions and are quite happy to ignore them. And they're quite happy to buy cheap Russian oil and gas and military technologies and the rest. And all Russia has to do is get it across the Caspian Sea to the northern coast of Iran, and there's a land bridge right through Pakistan, through India, into the Southeast Asia. Those two countries, Turkey and Iran, also want Russian investment in their economies, and they want Russia as a market for their goods. So they're getting closer and closer and closer. So it's happening before our eyes. Okay, so could this happen today, tomorrow, next year? Probably not, because there are a few factors that aren't aligned. We're on slide 35 now, factors not yet aligned. Some of these coalition partners are failed states. Libya's a failed state, Lebanon's a failed state, Syria's a failed state. They couldn't get their act together and provide troops to take part in this coalition. They're just not ready. They're barely holding it together. So this coalition couldn't form, within the next few years. 10 years, maybe. I also believe, this is my personal view, that more immigration to Israel has to take place before this event happens. Because as we will see, this event is formative for the nation of Israel. There's a reason why God does it. I'm going to come on to that next. It's formative. It changes their worldview and their attitude. And they have to be in the country for that to happen. Can you gain the benefits of military training by watching other people doing it? You can't. So you have to be doing it yourself. So I think a large proportion of the Jews currently in the diaspora, and we're talking about 7 million, have to return to Israel before this happens. But they are going. 30 every day at current count are engaging in Aliyah. And America is still too powerful and too involved in the Middle East. But with every passing year, they become more and more fixated solely on China, which is why President Trump has been saying, right, we're not going to back you up in Europe, because they can't. Their doctrine since the Second World War has been to have military powerful enough to fight a war in Europe and in the Far East at the same time. But they've let their military shrink in recent years. Joe Biden did that very badly. And they know they can't fight in two places at once. And the big enemy for them is China. So that all their focus is turning to China, and they're abandoning Europe, and they will abandon the Middle East, which means Israel will be on its own, which is why this coalition believes it can invade them. About 10 years. Okay, slide 36. What's God's purpose in causing the war? He tells us his purpose. I will make known my holy name among the people, my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I am the Holy One in Israel. This defense of Israel, this destruction by so many supernatural means, will only be interpretable in terms of God's direct supernatural intervention. He's effectively saying to the world, I am back. He's never gone away, but he's not intervened since Old Testament times in this way. He intervened to rebuild the nation of Israel, but, you can explain that away in social, political, and philosophical measures. The whole world will have to sit up and take notice and say there's no other way of explaining this other than God. And it's going to transform the attitude to God of the nation of Israel. On slide 37, you can see a graph, a pie chart. This is the current state of religious belief in Israel. There are 4 different groups. The ultra-Orthodox you already know, 9-10% of the population, mostly living in Jerusalem, strict observance of Mosaic law, keeping the 613 mitzvot. Then you've got a group which are a little more liberal, called the Datai or the Datim, but they're still observant and practicing. Then you've got what I would call the nominal religious Jews, called the Masorti. They would be our equivalent of liberal Christians. They go at Christmas and Easter and that sort of stuff. And then almost 50% of the population are agnostic or atheist. This event is going to transform that picture. The Jews won't be able to ignore this. And it will be personal to every living person in that nation. It won't be something that's happened somewhere else or happened in the history books. They won't be able to treat it academically because they will know that they are alive today because that happened. Because God did that. It's going to transform religious belief in Israel. And some people actually think, they argue, that this is going to make them all Messianic Jews. But it isn't. That's wrong. It won't. It'll make them observant. It'll make them believers. But they won't be Messianic yet. And we know they won't, because if they would become Messianic as a result of that war, the tribulation wouldn't happen. God wouldn't need it. This takes them part way, but not all the way. To get them all the way, you have to have the tribulation, where he brings them into the furnace of Jerusalem, and he turns the heat up. And the actions, the treatment, which converts roughly a third of the Jews to belief in Messiah, acceptance of Messiah, kills the rest. He gets rid of the impurities by the same process. That wouldn't be necessary if this action had converted them into Messianic Jews. So this is a step in the right direction. Just as the nation is formed in stages, slowly building to the complete thing, so their transformation in belief happens in stages over time, moved by different events. Now you might be thinking, well, has this current Hamas attack and the war that's going on in Israel now, has that had any effect? Is this one of these steps in the right direction? Has there been any change as a result of that? Well, some people think there has. I was reading an article in the Jerusalem Post last year by a rabbi who said that people in Israel are trying to understand the global hatred of them and the ferocity and bestiality of the Hamas attack using conventional explanations. And there's no geopolitical, social, psychological explanation for it at all. They cannot explain it. And the only thing they can think that explains it is the Bible. And he's saying that they aren't becoming more religious, but they're developing a biblical worldview. Because the Bible's explanation for things is the only thing that makes sense to them, the only thing that can account for this. 38, slide 38, conclusion. Let's revisit our research questions. Does this battle have a divinely appointed purpose? Yes, it does. It's not simply to punish Israel, although in part it does, as it destroys their city. But it is a continuation of God's plan for the redemption of that nation. It's a very painful lesson, but it does move the dial on their attitude to him and their belief in him. Doesn't go far enough, but it's a big change. He's reminding Israel and the world that he exists and that he is sovereign. He's punishing the nations that hate and attack Israel. And importantly, he creates the conditions necessary for Antichrist to take over Israel and the Middle East. Think about it. Israel is destroyed. Its economy is gone. Its army is gone. It can't rebuild its army, even though it's afraid that it's going to be attacked again. And it could be attacked and destroyed by smaller nations. It's so weak now. But it can't do that because every spare pair of hands has to go to rebuilding homes and schools and hospitals and communications. And they are so vulnerable and so weak. They know that God will protect them because they've just seen him do it. But just as they've done in Old Testament times, they look to a stronger power. They look for a patron. In Old Testament times, God says to them, don't go look into Egypt to protect you. Don't go look into Assyria. It'll end badly. And they ignored him, and they did. And they're going to ignore him again. And they're going to look to the Antichrist, who will come along and he will say, I'll tell you what, guys. I will put my armed forces, which I believe to be Europe, a European arm. I will put some of my armed forces in all your countries, and nobody will be able to attack anyone else, and you can rebuild your nations in peace, in confidence. Oh, and in addition, I'm going to give you big aid packages to help you along the way. And they will say, where's my pen? Let me sign that covenant. But just as in the past, it'll end badly. It's not for nothing that God calls this the covenant of death. And 3.5 years in, he will turn on them. Something else that occurred to me when I was preparing this talk is they're going to rebuild the temple. We know from prophecy that at the 3.5 year point in Jerusalem, the temple exists on the Temple Mount. This war facilitates that. Because if every wall in Israel collapses and falls to the ground, so do those awful mosques on the Temple Mount. Those 2 mosques will collapse. And the day after, there'll be heaps of rubble. And all the Israelis will have to do is take bulldozers up there and shove it off the edge. And they've got a clean slate on which to build the temple again. And the Antichrist will encourage them in that. And because everyone in the nation's now much more religious and observant, they will want it. They will want to honor God for what he's done to them by rebuilding the temple. Are there any implications for us in this? Yes, lots. Scripture tells us that the end times are going to be desperate times. There's going to be God's judgment on the world, but even before that, there's going to be terrible times because of increasing human sin. And I believe that the church is going to experience the leading edge of that. I'm not one of these people who says that while everything is still hunky-dory, we're going to be raptured out of the world. We're going to experience some of these difficult times. There's going to be wars. There's going to be storms. We may not go through the judgments that God inflicts on the world, the earthquakes, the famines, the pestilences, and stuff like that, but we will see wars and terrorisms and economic strife and increasing violence in society and all the rest, all those things that accompany increasing human wickedness. And we as a church have to be prepared for that. How do we deal with it when we find ourselves in these storms of persecution even? By looking to God and by looking to this prophecy as an example. Israel faced annihilation, but God in love intervened. He destroyed the most powerful attack on Israel ever. In fact, he orchestrated it all. He's in control of all those events. He's in control of the storms. They serve his purposes, which means he's bigger than the storms. So we don't look at the storms, we look at him, because he's bigger than the storms. And his infinite power is combined with an infinite love and compassion to save us. And we can see in his fulfillment of these prophecies and his protection of the nation of Israel and his determination after all their rebellion to redeem them, that he is a faithful God. The US Marines have a motto, Semper Fidelis, or Semper Fi. It means, what does it mean? Always faithful. And I think the church ought to have that motto too. Semper Fidelis, God is always faithful. I hope that's been meaningful to you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. Amen.